Happily, Chris Daw is with us, a King's Counsel, barrister and author of Justice on Trial, Why the System is Broken and How We Can Fix It. So, to begin, I mean, where to begin, Chris? I bet you weren't expecting to be dealing with questions like this when you woke up this morning, any more than I was expecting to be asking them. But, I mean, I don't want to turn it into a game of top trumps or a sort of hit parade. How serious is misconduct in public office, and how often do we see it in a court?
Well, firstly, James, when you're in my line of work, you tend to wake up to stories like this.
I take your point. Well, all right, but perhaps not with this.
Calls telling you that someone's in this position, so it's not so unusual for me. But so the answer is this. I mean, first of all, we all have to be super careful now, don't we? Because we all know that the Contempt of Court Act kicks in as soon as someone is arrested, and that means that any seriously prejudicial comment which is made in the media or on social media is potentially something for which you could be prosecuted yourself. So I think people need to be very, very careful about wild comment about this, particularly ill-informed comment. So let me answer your question. What's misconduct in public office? Well, it's broken down into 4 elements, and they are these. First of all, that the defendant must be a public officer acting as such. Now, that, in this case, is not, to me, entirely clear, but the police must be satisfied that he is a public or was a public officer. Secondly, they willfully neglect to perform a duty or willfully misconduct themselves in that public office. So that's the second element. The third element is that misconduct must be an abuse of the public's trust in them as an office holder. And finally, the conduct must be serious enough to deserve criminal punishment. So those are the 4 elements of misconduct in a public office. It's very, very broad, as you will gather. It can cover a multitude of circumstances, but without making any comment on the merits one way or the other, it seems that this is focused very clearly on the release of confidential government information to Jeffrey Epstein. That seems to be the gist of it. It does not, as far as I can see, have anything to do with sexual misconduct so far.
No, indeed, although investigations involving up to 9 police forces continue in that field as well. A slightly odd question for you, Chris. You may not want to or indeed be able to answer it, but our colleague Andy Hughes broke a story earlier this week that has had extraordinary traction, although it's likely to disappear under the weight of coverage of these latest developments today. And it was about Royal Protection, Close Protection officers reportedly going a bit native, turning a blind eye because of the status of the people that they were looking after. How will the legal system, the police, presumably lawyers, does the status play any part at all in the process now? And I'm thinking more subconsciously than consciously. There'll be police officers who are pinching themselves, right, and poking their phones around the corner of the custody suite, one imagines.
Yeah, I mean, this is always difficult. I've done a number of very, very high-profile criminal cases involving very high-profile individuals, and you do find that the police do sometimes behave in ways that are quite extraordinary compared to the way that they behave for sort of anonymous people, if you like, or someone who's not in the public eye. The reality is that is a danger. When we've seen it over the years many times with protection officers in different situations with members of the royal family and so forth, where there has been a suggestion of behaviour that crosses the line in terms of becoming more of a personal support network rather than acting in an official capacity as a police officer. And police officers are definitely public officers acting as such. So if any police officer was involved in any improper or unlawful behaviour in relation to Andrew, then that would expose that officer to risk.
Do we know, I mean, forgive me if you answered this, I don't think you did, precisely what makes, I think you said you didn't know, that what makes a public officer a public officer? Because speaking entirely as a member of the public, I'm not sure I had any idea that Andrew Windsor held a role that involved him being a public officer, as in sort of representing me in any way.
Well, you may not have been, but the police are clearly satisfied of that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have arrested him for this offence. And as I understand it, this relates to a period when he was a trade ambassador of some kind for the UK, and we know that he did fulfil trade roles over the years with foreign governments and elsewhere, and of course there has been a certain amount of scandal about some of that activity on his part. But all I can tell you is that there is a narrow category of people. It does include government ministers, it does include civil servants, police officers, and people who are obviously acting on behalf of the public, and it does also include people who are contracted or or in some way commissioned by the government to act in a public office on behalf of the public, as Andrew apparently was.
Yeah, so it may have looked like something of a sinecure from the outside, but from the inside, as you remind us, it would have been government sanctioned, and therefore, for the police's purposes and indeed for ours, it would be public office. Unfair question. Can you think of cases from the past, like what would be the big textbook cases of misconduct in public office that you would have learned at law school, or students might still study today?
I was involved in perhaps one of the most high-profile ones, which was the Hillsborough prosecution of the police officers in the Hillsborough case for their dealings with the evidence gathering, etc. After the Hillsborough disaster, where it was suggested that they had misconducted themselves. Of course, they were all actually cleared in the end by either a jury or a judge. But that's the sort of a classic example. There haven't been a huge number of prosecutions for this, but it can often be used even for much simple things, like a police officer who, accesses criminal records to help for his friends. It can be something as low level as that, or it can be something as high level as sharing state secrets with a convicted paedophile, as seems to be the allegation here.
Was John Profumo ever prosecuted for it? I should know this.
John Profumo, I'm afraid I don't know if it was misconduct in public office or some other form of espionage or something of that kind. I don't remember the specific offence, but the headline issue, in the sense of revealing confidential government information to a foreign power, as it was in his case, is the same principle here. I mean, if you reveal highly sensitive and confidential government information to a private individual who has no interest in that and no legitimate interest in that information, then there is obviously going to be a risk of prosecution.
And there will be a solicitor hot-footing his way probably to Kidlington in Oxfordshire, or to somewhere in those environs as we speak, with a quite extraordinary brief in front of them, potentially.
Well, absolutely, there will, of course, and Andrew has previously been represented by solicitors, and that's in the public domain. I'm not going to mention any names, but the name of solicitors have been acting for him in the past are in the public domain, and I'm sure that whilst, again, we can say that sometimes lawyers can be prone to sort of celebrity kind of behaviours, etc., I'm sure that the lawyer will do his or her job and ensure that Andrew is properly advised, and that the interactions with the police are conducted fully under legal advice of his rights and indeed the risks attaching to police interviews.
Chris, given that we're all going to be using the word unprecedented an unprecedented amount of times today, before I let you go, are there any questions I should have asked you that you haven't actually answered yet?
Well, I mean, I don't think so, because I think the problem is that you mentioned before how this is a huge story, and this is going to be headline news now all over the world, no doubt, for days and days. But the difficulty is that we don't really know very much. We don't know what the police have got. We don't know what the evidence is. We've seen some of the Epstein files releases, the material that's come out recently, which relate to Prince Andrew in different ways. But apart from that fairly limited public information, we just don't know the scope of the investigation. So personally, whilst I'm happy to come on and kind of explain the mechanics of this to you, I think we all need to just for the time being, avoid this kind of speculation which tends to end in problems for the criminal process, and indeed doesn't really help the public's understanding if we are totally speculative rather than sticking to what we do know.
Wise words indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Chris Daw, barrister and author of Justice on Trial: Why the System is Broken and How We Can Fix It. And of course, Chris also reminding us why, under advisement as things stand, we are not going to be inviting phone calls onto the programme. Not because I don't trust you, because I do, but because none of us have found ourselves in situations quite like this before, and the very last thing anybody would want to do is jeopardise any criminal investigation, even though, as I have repeated on a number of occasions, no charges have yet been brought. I love the moment, though, of people just turning on the radio. Oh, flipping out, I've missed the first 45 minutes of James's show. I wonder what he's wanging on about now. So you've just clicked your radio on. I've always got you in the back of my mind, by the way. The person who has just in that moment turned the radio on. Because sometimes you'll hear things that make absolutely no sense at all out of context. Lifted completely out of context. But today, if you are just joining us, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, as he currently calls himself, the former Duke of York, the former Prince Andrew, is under arrest. He was arrested this morning at his new home in Norfolk, or at least where he's currently staying, on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. And he is under arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office, which Chris Daw has happily just provided us with a much better understanding of. 10:45 is the time. I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate. I mean, I'm glad that the late Queen isn't alive to see this, actually, because it is a moment of, I'm going to use the word, and I'm going to stop making jokes about using the word because it's the only word that fits. It's a moment of unprecedented jeopardy.